Hello, my name is Roger Coghill. I'm a biologist, and this is the third of a series of talks I'm giving about what we would call today nutraceuticals and in new approaches to our lifestyles. If you've seen the first couple of talks, you'll hear me saying that we need a new approach to medicine and to the way we look at health today. And that's what I want to be the subject of this talk, which is coming off the wall a bit, I suppose, for most people. It's not based on so much on mainstream science, but points the way to mainstream science. And it all begins, this story, about 100 years ago nearly, and in the laboratories, or in the clinic really, of a doctor by the name of Albert Abrams. Now, Abrams was based in San Francisco. He was a fine doctor and very concerned with his patients. He had a good reputation for his own research in his medical studies. And he was practicing at about the same time that X-rays were just coming into clinical use. And so it was that his practice, his clinic, was next door to a room in which there was an X-ray machine. Now, in those days, one way they would test the health of a patient would be what they call today percussion, where they tap their tummy muscles to see how much tension there is there. And what Abrams noticed, to his amazement, was that if he had a patient who was conducting a percussion on the stomach muscles to test for their tonality, and somebody turned the X-ray machine on in the room next door, his patient's stomach muscles would go flabby. There was a distinct change in the tone of the muscles as a result of the X-ray being turned on. Well, this must have been an absolute amazement to him. Remember that X-rays were only really discovered in 1895, and that here was Abrams practicing in the early years of the next century, in the early 1900s. So X-ray machines weren't as much used as they are today by any manner of means. Well, he got very intrigued by this phenomenon, tested it in every which way, but found that it was completely replicable. Whenever the X-ray machine was turned on, the stomach muscles of the patient turned flabby. In the same way, I suppose, that hundreds of years before, 100 years or two before, Luigi Galvani, as I mentioned in another talk, had, with equal amazement, discovered that whenever his wife turned a machine which caused sparks, when the sparks flew at the other end of his lab, his scalpel would cause a metal scalpel would cause a frog's leg to contract, the muscles of the leg to contract. So here were two examples now of something that was going on at a distance without any chemical involvement. Now that, I think, set the foundations for a new kind of medicine, a medicine which still isn't in the mainstream, but which Albert Abrams developed. He realized, with a good deal of practice and research, that he could actually diagnose what kind of illness his patients have using that kind of approach, by listening to the radiations, if you like. He called them electronic radiations, at a distance, without having to intervene physically with his patient in any way, even chemically. And he made a study of this for the rest of his life, and eventually, in about 1916, produced a book which he called, here I have a copy of it, in very bad shape, I have to say, but he called it The Electronic Reactions of Albert Abrams. And he wrote this book called New Concepts in Diagnosis and Treatment, and he called it physico-clinical medicine, not chemical medicine. Now this book, which is in, as I say, very bad shape, records the extent of his research and how far he went. In fact, he went a long way. Not only did he manage to diagnose accurately with this approach the physical ailments of his patients, but he went further and found that he could actually treat his patients with the same approach, the non-chemical radiation at a distance. And it's from Abrahams that we get the famous black box that people used to call his invention. But he had lots of inventions, and they were all based on this whole principle of the electron rather than the compound, the chemical compound. His ideas were based on the excitation of electrons and their perception. He was much more physical than chemical, and that got him into a lot of hot water because, of course, nobody would believe it for a moment. But he was very successful, and other doctors started to use his instruments for the same purpose and found that they too could use them to cure their patients. So this in turn caused a great deal of furore amongst the medical establishment, and the result of that was that Abrahams was branded as a fraud. Because he wouldn't let any of his patents be shared with people who wanted to make money out of them, he was, how shall I say, bullied by the medical fraternity of the time, and a load of articles against him appeared in Scientific American and so on, so that in the end he was so affected by this calumny that he died much younger than he should have done, sadly. And his medicine more or less got carried on by others. But at the time, in about 1922, the president of the British Medical Association, Sir James Barr, made an astonishing prediction. He said in 1922, he said, there will come a day when every important person will carry about with them a cordless telephone. He said, and when that day comes, Abraham's researches will at last gain the accolades that they deserve. Now, what a prediction, because he had no idea that we would be in today's world using so many mobile phones all around the world now. And so it's time, I think, for us to give a more serious consideration of that kind of medicine. It's never really died away. There have been other practitioners. In Scotland, Dr. Boyd started to use the Abrahams methods of diagnosis and treatment, so much so that the British Medical Association sent a delegation under Lord Horder to investigate Boyd. They came along and he said, look, I can show you that people can sense a chemical in a closed file, a glass file, at a distance of 10 feet away, and they can get it right every time as to whether there is the chemical in that bottle or not. And he demonstrated it to such an extent. They looked everywhere to try and find a fraud, but they couldn't. Then they tried it and they found that they too could have this sensitivity. We all appear to have it, but we never use it because we don't realize it exists. So there is a sensitivity in us which can detect quite significant substances at a distance. And if we can detect them, then we can detect them with instruments today. And that's what's really happened. There have been a number of books on the subject of radionics as it became known. And the whole concept of energy medicine, here's another book on energy medicine, is beginning to take shape. We shouldn't be too surprised, because evidence that bodies can affect us at a distance is only too obvious when you think about the moon. The moon affects the tides, the moon affects people. And here is a book called The Lunar Effect, which describes the many ways in which an object 250,000 miles away can have an influence on our well-being. Well, I suppose most of that got crystallized as we became more and more aware of the ways in which radio frequency and microwave radiation can be used. Today we think nothing of it. Today we pick up a remote and change the channels on our television using an instrument which has no chemical connection with the television whatsoever. So it's not as if it's unknown. We use a cell phone which can speak to a mast, a cell phone base station, as much as 5 kilometers away. So that whole idea that electrons can carry information is now becoming accepted because we have the proof of it with our everyday lives. Well, I wrote a book about it called Something in the Air, which goes into the matter of how we are affected and how we can affect other people with our own influence, if you like. And that if we can affect their mood, then I think we can also affect their health. Well, this whole idea became more debated in serious scientific circles when Rupert Sheldrake in the 70s came up with his view about a new science of life, a book which the Times said it should only be burnt and not read. But in this book, Sheldrake comes up with a lot of facts to support the idea that our bodies are not simply reacting to chemicals, they can react to electromagnetic radiations as well. And the idea that Abrahams had in the early part of the 1900s is beginning to get currency more and more. One of the foremost pioneers of this approach, this new approach to medicine, was Paul Schmidt, who wrote a book on what he called bioresonance, the ability of machines to create frequencies and radiations which can in turn help to make people better or can make people worse. It doesn't have to be only good. For example, one device which they call a homeotron is where you can actually either create a frequency which is beneficial to the person at a distance, or you can create a frequency which is adverse to that person. For example, in the 70s, a very good book on bioelectromagnetics written by Alexander Pressman, a Russian, which was translated into English, records how you can use electromagnetic frequencies, EMFs, EM fields, to hit bugs in a field. For example, he says, experimental data show that in certain conditions, EMFs may have a stimulating effect on the growth and development of crop plants. Such an effect can apparently be produced by direct exposure of seeds to EMFs of various frequencies and static fields, or by an indirect method, by treatment of the water used to water the plants. Now that was a beneficial effect on the plant's growth. But another company set up by a team of scientists, Upton, Knuth and Armstrong, found they could use different frequencies to exterminate insects in those crop fields, and demonstrated it successfully to a lot of farmers who bought their method until they were taken to court by the agricultural pesticide manufacturing associations, and they were taken to court so repeatedly that they became bankrupt and their method disappeared. But you can't keep a good man down, and eventually the truth will out. And today we have some 5,000 practitioners practicing bioresonance across Europe according to this method, which in this new edition of the book lists the frequencies and shows you how to use the machines which can do that. So that is a new form of medicine that I wanted to bring to your attention, and I hope you find it interesting and able to follow it up. If you look up bioresonance, you will find a lot more about it on the internet. Well, thanks for listening. I will continue this saga in my next talk, and speak to you soon.